Welcome to the Mad in America podcast, your source for science, psychiatry, and social justice. Hello, this is James, and welcome to the Mad in America podcast. This week we have an interview between doctoral student Akansha Vaswani and Dr. Peter Groot, researcher at the Department of Psychiatry and Psychology, Maastricht University Medical Center in the Netherlands. Akansha is a doctoral candidate at the University of Massachusetts, Boston, and her dissertation research will involve interviewing psychiatrists in the US about their experiences helping people stop or reduce their dose of antidepressant medication. Dr. Groot has led the development of tapering strips, which are a novel and practical method by which people taking antidepressants, benzodiazepines, and some other classes of drug can gradually and slowly reduce their dosage. In a recent study published in the journal Psychosis, Dr. Groot, together with Professor Jim Van Os, reported on the results of their trial, which recorded the experiences of people using tapering strips.
So, as I read the article that was published in the journal Psychosis, one of the questions that I was thinking would be really interesting for people to hear your answer to was, what motivated you to do this study? What were you noticing about antidepressant use that prompted you to do this?
Well, the background, and basically that's because I started as a patient using antidepressants in, I think, 15 or 16 years ago now. And my background is that I'm also a scientist. I'm not a doctor. I studied chemistry. And after that, I did genetic research for a number of years. But after this depression, this stopped. And then because I started using an antidepressants, I got interested in how does it work? Does it work for me? That sort of questions. Mm-hmm. And to make a very long story short, this sort of changed my life. I became involved in finding a solution for these withdrawal symptoms because I thought that this was possible. Mm-hmm. And I was not the only one because all these patients who've been trying to reduce their own doses, they in fact already knew where to look. And I think they had it right. So that's basically the motivation.
So wanting to figure out a way to help patients withdraw off the medication.
Yes.
So could you guide us through, the study, how it was set up, and some of the major findings?
I can. Mm-hmm. What we did is in the Netherlands, quite a number of people, I think several thousand now, have used this tapering medication. And what we did from the beginning is after they had used it, we sent them a short questionnaire because we wanted to know how well do these tapering strips or this tapering medication, how well does it work? And we asked a few questions, which we found very important. The first one was, did you experience withdrawal symptoms? And people could answer that on a scale from 1 to 7. 1 being not at all, and 7 being very much. We also asked, how did tapering go? So how did you feel for yourself? How did it, on a scale of 1 to 7 again, and 1 is it went very well, and 7 is it went very bad. We also asked, did you try to taper previously? And that is without the use of the tapering medication. Mm-hmm. So tapering as it is done in clinical practice currently. And we asked how many times. We asked how did this go? And we asked, did you have withdrawal symptoms? The same questions we asked when people used the tapering medication. And we asked people, what is the goal of the use of this tapering medication? Do you want to taper completely? Or do you want to reduce the dose, which is what some people want? Or do you have other reasons? And we asked, how long did you use antidepressants before? And then they could choose between less than a year, 1 to 2 years, 2 to 5 years, 5 to 10 years, or more than 10 years. And then, of course, we knew the age, the sex of the persons. We knew which medication, which antidepressants they had used. And we knew how many of these tapering strips they had used. So we knew how long they had been tapering. And there were places for people to place comments and to make remarks.
Okay.
So in effect, it's a very simple, observational, retrospective study.
And before we move on, could you give us a brief explanation of what tapering strips are and how they're
Uh,
different from what's usually done in clinical practice?
Well, I begin with what's usually done in clinical practice, and then I have to start with the medication that is provided by pharmacists. And that is basically determined by what big pharmaceutical companies have developed. So, and what they generally do is they have to register a certain dose. They do clinical trials, and the outcome of this is that for most medication, for most medicines, medication comes in only a few registered doses. For instance, if I take venlafaxine, the antidepressants I use, that's 37.5 milligrams, 75 and 150. And I think there's also one of 225 milligrams, but that's it. For other medications, it's like 10, 20, 40 milligrams. There are even drugs for which there is only one single registered dose. And this is, over the years, I've found that I found this increasingly weird, because basically what happens if somebody gets depressed and he goes to a doctor and the doctor does everything right, and you have two persons, then both persons will start with the same recommended doses, which is written in a guideline. And it doesn't matter if one person is female and 50 kilograms and the other one is 200 kilograms and male. They both will start with the same registered doses, which is very weird if you think what we do when we buy shoes or when we wear glasses or we buy clothing. We would find it very weird if we could only choose between shoes of size 35, 40 and 45. That's the first thing that's problematic when you taper, because if people taper, initially, I think people used antidepressants for some time and then they just stopped. And then people found out this is not going okay. So what we do is we halve the dose.
Okay.
And then they found out this is still problematic. So we halve the dose again. And basically that's where we got stuck, because not much more has happened since then. And the problem is these steps people have to make when they reduce the dose are too large. Our body adapts when we use certain medications for a longer period of time. And then if you stop using a medication, it takes some time to adapt to the new situation. If you do this too fast, then we get in trouble. So the way to do it better is to make the steps smaller. Like on a staircase, you can take 3 very big steps, but you can also take 6 smaller steps or 8 smaller steps or 16 smaller steps. And basically, that is the idea that we tried to put into practice. And what you need for that is medication in different dosages. And to do this, we developed a system in which a compounding pharmacist makes doses of 1 milligram, for instance, 2 milligram, 5 milligram, 10 milligram. And then by combining a few of these tablets, just like with the coins in your wallet, you can make every dose you want with a limited number of tablets. So instead of going from 20 milligrams to 10 milligrams to 0, you can go from 20 milligram to 19 milligram to 18 milligram to 17 milligram and so on. And basically that's what's being done in a tapering strip. So instead of going in big steps, we try to make the steps as small as possible. And then one tapering strips you taper in a period of 4 weeks. And then you go from a certain dose to a certain lower dose. So you can go from 20 milligrams to 0 in 4 weeks. But if this is too fast, you can go first from 20 to 10 milligrams in 4 weeks, and then from 10 to 0 in 4 weeks. If this is going too fast, you can go from 10 to 5 in 4 weeks and from 5 to 0 in 4 weeks. So you can, in a quite easy way, determine how long and how slow, how gradual do you want the taper to be.
And so, as you were sending the tapering strips out to the patients in your study, how were decisions being made about how much someone needed or how little? How did they know how quickly or how slowly to reduce the dose?
Well, this is a very important and difficult question also, and perhaps also an easy question, because there's an interesting thing in this whole withdrawal problem, or in this tapering, is that actually the doctor cannot know and does not know, if he sits opposite to an individual patient, what the best way is for this patient to taper the medication. Because one patient can easily stop in a few steps and doesn't report any problem. And other patients, they take way more time and still have much more problems. And the differences between patients are very large. And that's also why guidelines have never been of much help thus far in withdrawal. Because for any advice a doctor gives can be okay for some patients, but it will not be okay for others. So this is the big problem. The doctor cannot predict. He can have sort of an idea, but he cannot predict reliably what is best for the patient. On the other hand, the patient, him or herself, also does not know this. So what do you do then? And our answer is discuss what we know. And doctors do know a number of things about drugs and about what can happen. And give the patient a number of concrete options to choose from. And this in my mind is very important, let the patient decide. Because a patient knows what his or her fears are, what his or her desires are. And probably they know it better than the doctors do, because it's their body. And if nobody knows, why is it not the patient who should decide? And the thing to realize is that if you don't know if what you choose is right, that does not have to be a real problem. Because what is important is that the doctor and the patient discuss this with each other, and especially discuss what will happen during the tapering. How will I guide you? And the doctor has options if tapering turns out to go too fast. If people experience withdrawal symptoms because tapering goes too fast, then there are several options for a doctor and a patient to choose from. One is to go back to the original dose. The second one is to stay on the dose where the patient is at for a while until the withdrawal symptoms disappear. And another option is to continue tapering, but at a lower speed. And all these things are possible, but we cannot tell what a certain patient should do. But the patient and the doctor together, I think, can have a pretty good idea of how they can establish this. And I think our study, in fact, shows that this works quite well.
So tell us a little bit about that. How many people were able to be successful stopping their medication if that was their goal, or reducing the medication if that was their goal, using the tapering strips?
Well, then I come to some figures, and the total number of patients we sent questionnaires to was 1,750. And we received almost 1,200 patients who filled them in. So that's a response of 86%, which is, I think, quite nice.
That's pretty good.
That's pretty good. And 1,121 patients were using them to taper antidepressants. There were also some other medications. And 895, so almost 900, told that their goal was to taper completely, so from their current dose to 0. And about 70% of them succeeded in doing that. That's I think, one of the most important numbers in our study. And then there were a number of patients who wanted to lower the dose. There were patients who were having other reasons we don't know about, and some patients we had no data about. It's 900 patients, roughly, who wanted to stop completely, and about 70% succeeded in doing that.
That's a pretty high number.
Yes.
And what's your sense about the people who did not succeed in tapering? Do you have any hypothesis about why that may have been the case?
Well, that's a difficult question because at this point in time, there are several things I have to mention here. First of all, a number of these patients were still tapering. Some patients, a number of patients reported that they stopped tapering because they suffered from withdrawal symptoms. A number of patients reported that they suffered from relapse. They said, my old complaints came back. But all these things, because we could only ask this, it's difficult to draw firm conclusions from that. Also, because there are some problems with regard to the reimbursement of the tapering strips. Insurance companies in Netherlands, most of them, they up until now refuse to pay for them, which sort of forces patients to taper faster, perhaps, than they otherwise should have done. So my feeling is that we should focus on the positive results of this study, because we do not have a real answer yet about the people who could not taper. Who did not succeed in tapering, because there are too many factors we don't know enough about. For instance, a patient who reports that he or she is suffering from withdrawal, this could actually be also a symptom of a coming relapse. But a patient who reports that his old complaints are coming back, this could also be withdrawal symptoms. Right. And it's absolutely impossible for us, based on this questionnaire, to make any distinction about that.
Exactly. Those are important questions for future research. So can you guide us through an example of one person, maybe one patient, who used the tapering strip successfully?
Well, it's a bit difficult and a bit dangerous for me to describe only one patient because of the risk of generalization. And what I can tell is based on not only the questionnaires, but also the emails I get, the questions I get. Sometimes people phone me and they ask me questions. They tell what is happening. And what I do then is, first I make clear that I'm not a doctor, that I cannot give and do not want to give treatment advice to individual patients. But what I try to do is answer questions as best as I can, explain things and provide information. And what I then do is tell people, go with this information to your doctor and together discuss what should be done. And based on the stories I hear, the conversations I have, I see this is very rough, but I see, in fact, three sorts of I can categorize patients in three groups. One group says, I used your tapering strip and it was fantastic because I did not suffer withdrawal symptoms or so little that it is fine with me. I could taper completely and I'm off of my medication and I'm happy. That's very simple. Then there are patients who suffer from withdrawal, and this can be more or less severe. And then there are several options. And that's what I always try to explain. One of the things is to go back to your old dose. This is one of the options that's also in the guidelines. And then if it's withdrawal symptoms, they should go away fairly quickly. The other, that's also in guidelines, is to stabilize. Stay at your current dose for a while. And if it's withdrawal symptoms, they will go back quite within a few days, probably, sometimes very quickly. Or you are willing to bear the withdrawal symptoms because they are not too bad, but because you suffer them, that's an indication that you are probably going too fast. And then it's wise to adapt the speed of your taper. So slow down. And then, of course, you have the patients who relapse, but it's very difficult if somebody calls you, and I'm not a doctor, to at a distance draw any firm conclusions about that. But we must realize that some patients actually benefit from using an antidepressant, and for them it might be better not to stop.
So you would suggest that maybe they take this information to their doctors?
That's what I always suggest. The thing with the tapering medication is that it is not something that replaces a doctor. I must stress that. It is something to help the patient and the doctor to do something the doctors are supposed to do, and that is to help their patients to taper in a proper way. I only think that the role of the doctor, in my opinion, should change. The current situation in which we more or less expect, often implicitly, that the doctor knows what is best for a patient, I think that what we have seen is that this doesn't work very well. It works for a number of patients, but there's a whole number of patients for which it does not work well. And the doctor can not be blamed for this, in fact, because they cannot predict what is good for a patient. But if they are forced to tell a patient, you should do it like this, then they are sort of overstretching their capabilities. It's much easier for a doctor, I think, to say to a patient, listen, you want to taper. I've got a problem. I don't know what the best way for you is to do this. I cannot know this. But I do have a number of good options, and we are going to talk about it together. We choose and we make appointments. We discuss how I will guide you and how you will monitor your symptoms. If you have symptoms, call me. We will adapt the schedule. And I think if you do that, and I think that's pretty much what's been done in the study also, the study done in real life, then in the end, it's going to be better for everybody, for the doctor and for the patient. And the role of the patient is not diminished by a tapering strip. It's not a do-it-yourself kit, but it becomes much more easy.
Have you worked with any doctors with the tapering strips, if they have any feedback about how they've worked?
Yes, when I started this, I was doing this as a volunteer for a foundation, Cinderella, a not-for-profit foundation. They enabled me to start doing this. This brought me in contact with Professor Jim van Os, who was then a professor in Maastricht and currently in Utrecht. And he has become part of this endeavor. And over the years, some time ago, we have asked all doctors who have used or prescribed tapering strips, who had experience with the tapering strips, to report their experiences. And generally, they are very, very positive about them. And I think for the reasons I just told you, because they discover that their lives become easier, their patients are more satisfied. Even the patients, and I must stress this, for who the tapering does not work as they wished, because they have withdrawal symptoms, or even if they have a relapse, because they have the feeling that they understand much better what is happening. If they are allowed to choose themselves, it becomes their own decision, which makes it easier to bear the consequences. Much easier than when somebody says, you do this, you're going to be okay, and you find out that you are not okay.
Okay, Peter. So can you tell us a little bit about people's success rates using the tapering strips versus people who try to withdraw the usual way?
I can. Because in our study, there were 692 patients who had used tapering medication to taper their antidepressant, but who had also tried to taper the same antidepressants in the past. And the results, I think, are very clear-cut. Their past attempts, and it's important to realize that in quite a lot of cases, people had tried 2 or 3, some people have tried 5 times or more to stop using this medication, and they failed. So they went on using the antidepressant without knowing if it was actually doing them any good or not. because they felt they had to do this because otherwise they would suffer from these withdrawal symptoms so terribly. And we asked them, how did you experience withdrawal symptoms? And these past attempts, they report that the average complaints they report is a 6. So on a scale from 1 to 7, and 1 is not at all, 7 is very much, it was a 6. With the use of tapering strips, the average was 3.2. So it was about half the amount. And with the tapering strips, most of them, the majority of them, succeeded in stopping using or tapering their antidepressants from their dose to 0. And I think this is a very important result. And it's especially very important because the comparison, and this is methodologically very important, was done within a patient. Mm-hmm. So it was the same patient who had tried before and who without, and who had tried with the tapering medication. And this is very different from clinical studies in which a comparison is always made between patients. In clinical studies, a group of patients is divided in 2 equal groups, and then we would make a comparison between without and with. And then we would say, oh, there's a small difference, so this method is better than that one. Mm-hmm. But actually, the result there is an average, and we use this average to guide individual patients who differ much more than the differences between these groups. So actually, I think this evidence from about 700 patients is much stronger than all previous evidence from all previous study, of which there are almost none, that have been done thus far.
Thank you for sharing that. And can you talk a little bit now about this, the context of your findings given polypharmacy, or the fact that a lot of patients use more than one medication, and the importance of helping people taper or stop medication within that broader context of polypharmacy?
Well, you're right that many patients in our daily clinical practice use more than one medicine. And this is also very different from most clinical studies in which a selected group of patients is taken who is often different from what a general practitioner sees in his office. And that's another strong point, I think, of our study, is that this was done in so to say, real life, in daily clinical practice. So we set no barriers on people who used it. We also don't know, by the way, if they used other medication, but it is quite likely that a number of patients did this. And what we show is, even in this context, it is possible for patients to taper a drug using these tapering strips. And sometimes we have had questions from people, I use several drugs and I want to taper them all. And then what I say is that, well, discuss this, of course, with your doctor, but if you do, taper one medicine at a time and discuss with your doctor which medicine you want to taper first. But don't try to taper them all at once, because my guess is that could be a recipe for a disaster, but I don't know.
Right. Going back to what you said early on in this interview about too rapid changes happening too quickly. So, given that the tapering strips have had such impressive results, what are some of your hopes about how these strips will be used going forward?
Well, first and foremost, my goal at this moment is to achieve that people who want to taper a drug will be allowed to use tapering medication when a doctor wants to prescribe this. Mm-hmm. And this is an issue that is very pressing here, because our health insurers, some of them, most of them, they do not want to reimburse the medication, which I think is weird, given the fact that they pay for antidepressants for 20, 30 years. And when somebody wants to stop, and it's difficult, and it's a problem that's been there for decades now, It has been created by the big pharmaceutical companies when they brought these drugs on the market. The problem has never been solved. And now there is a solution. Then to say that we will not pay for it is, in my view, absurd. But this is my first goal. The second goal, what I want to achieve is that shared decision making becomes a key element of the way doctors deal with this problem of tapering. I don't believe anymore in, say, clear-cut recommendation like a patient who uses this medicine and looks like this, he should taper in 1 month, and a patient who looks a little bit different, we will allow to do it in 2 months, because we simply cannot predict this. While if you let the doctor and the patient work together in the way I described before, I think you get much better results, and both the doctor and the patient will be much more satisfied. And this is not only true if patients are able to stop their drug completely, but this is also the case if patients discover that the tapering went well, and we get reports like this, but after a while my old complaints come back. And then if you taper carefully and you don't have withdrawal symptoms, it's quite likely that the fact that you get your old complaints back is not the result of withdrawal symptoms. And that might indicate that the antidepressant in this case you use was actually good for something. And then if people start using it again and they find out, I feel much better now, it may help them to be more willing or accepting the fact that they use an antidepressant. I'm an example myself. I have tapered my medication a number of years ago, and this was part of an experiment. It has been published, and the tapering went well because I knew how I had to do this, and I was able to get the proper medication. It was before the tapering medication was available. So tapering for me went fine, but after about 4 weeks I had stopped. I got my old complaints back. I started worrying again, and a lot of other complaints, sleeping less, got much more irritated, and it didn't go away. And after 4 months I thought, well, I've had it. I started using antidepressants again, and after a few weeks I found out that I felt much better. And the bonus I got from this is that in the 8.5 years before that, I used this drug. I use venlafaxine at a dose of 150 milligram. And currently I'm using it as a dose of 75 milligram, which I consider to be beneficial because we don't know precisely, but probably it has something to do with less side effects. But it made me realize that now, after so many years, I've always thought that antidepressants help me, but I think that for me, I have proof that this is really the case. And I'm, how would you call it? I'm a happy user of antidepressants because they really help me. So that's also an outcome. And it's important, whichever outcome it is, that the process is going in such a way that and the doctor and the patient can be satisfied about this. The tapering medication we have is not to help everybody, to get everybody off antidepressants, because I really think there are people who benefit from them. The thing is to find out who benefits and who does not benefit.
And that should be guided by a shared decision-making process rather than being driven by only the doctor.
Yes, and I think our study, in fact, is strong proof for that. Because these people who had tapered before, I think more than average, they know what they wanted when they went to their doctors. Because in the beginning, especially, it were the patients, and it were the more active patients who discovered the existence of tapering medication. And in many cases, they went to their doctor and they said, this is available now, can I use this? And especially in the beginning, their doctors were not aware of the existence of this medication. So they were informed by their patients. And because these patients had, in many cases, had bad experiences in the past, they knew that they did not want to taper very quickly. And I think that doctors agreed with that. And in many cases, this went well. So, and that's why I think that shared decision making is much, much better, more efficient, and in the end, more cheaper and more satisfying than trying to develop all sort of predictive tests. Because what we see is that we keep on trying to do that, but thus far it's very hard, and it's not been possible to do this.
Right. And if there's people outside of the Netherlands at the moment who want access to these tapering strips, who want to reduce or stop their medication, is it available outside the Netherlands?
As far as I know, it is. The requirement is that it's necessary to have a description of a certified doctor. So you have to have a prescription which should be signed by a certified doctor. And you can send it to the pharmacist. And if everything goes well, he can just ship the medication. And I think it's already happening, at least to countries like the UK and other countries. So in principle, it is possible, yes.
That's good to know for people who might want access to this across different countries. So is there anything that you want to say about the study that I may not have asked you?
You asked me what I would like to achieve with the tapering strips. There are still a lot of things we basically do not know about currently when it comes to tapering. I mean, there's been a host of clinical studies, but they have yielded very little, especially because, and the reason is the fact that this has always been group research, which is, in my view, not the optimal tool if patients in themselves are so different from each other. So what I think we should do is ask people, and that's also what we want to do, when they start using antidepressants, if they want to monitor themselves, and this can be done using a mobile phone, and if we can use the data of those patients, and a large number of patients do this over a longer time, then within 1 or 2 years we will get a lot of useful information which will help us to improve the situation of the tapering, but also resolve some issues about which there is currently quite a lot of debate. Like how much people are suffering from withdrawal. One party says, well, it's generally not a problem. And others say it's a terrible problem. Well, actually, I think both sides may be right. The majority of patients probably does not have too much problems in tapering, but there's a minority of 10 or 20%, depending on the drug, which really do have problems. But currently, we don't have good numbers, because the way we did research thus far, I think, was not adequate. And I think following people during tapering will give us a lot of answers about things we currently don't know.
Yeah, and for people who want to access these tapering strips, were most of the patients who took part in the study or answered the questionnaires, were they taking a specific SSRI, or was it mainly SSRIs?
So not only SSRIs, because there were also people who are using it for benzodiazepines. There is 1 or 2 pain medications for which there are tapering strips available. The pharmacist is working on tapering strips for anti-epileptic drugs, which can also have quite severe side effects if people have to stop too quickly. And every now and then I get new requests, for instance, from doctors, is there also a tapering strips for this medicine or for that medicine? But in the study, it were mostly antidepressants. And it was mostly venlafaxine and paroxetine, because those are the 2 most difficult drugs that, with respect to withdrawal symptoms, which, if I may say, also makes it clear that that tapering really helps, because these are the most difficult drugs, and it makes a huge difference if patients are allowed to taper gradually compared to tapering too fast.
And, a final question is, can you say a little bit about the average length of time, the 70% that succeeded? How long did it take? How many months did they use the tapering strips for?
It's easiest to answer this question if you look to one specific medicine. And we did this for venlafaxine, which is a very problematic drug when it comes to tapering. And we looked for tapering from 37.5 milligrams to 0. And 37.5 milligram, this is relevant for people who know this, is the lowest available dose for venlafaxine. And then what you see is that 37% of the patients who used the tapering strips used one tapering strips. 21% used 2, 32% used 3, and 8% used 4, and 2.7% of the people used more than 4 tapering strips. Mm-hmm. And the median, which is almost the same as the average, is 2 tapering strips or 65 days. But what you see is this spread. So there is quite a number of patients who can do it faster. Mm-hmm. And there's a small group of patients who really needs to taper over a longer period of time. But in our study, this is about 10% of the patient who needs more than 3 months. Mm-hmm. Or I should now correct, who used more than 3 months. It may perhaps be better for them to take somewhat longer, but this would shift the total length of tapering not very much, I think, because mm-hmm. it's a minority, but it is a minority who have severe problems. Mm-hmm. And a minority that has been neglected by the medical community thus far.
Yeah, and your numbers really shed light on the variability among patients.
Yeah, because that's key, and that's what often forgotten. Often people discuss about these problems, and one person says it's not a problem at all, and the other person says it's a huge problem, but it depends on which patient you are. If you're lucky, it's not a problem for you. But if you're unlucky, it is a real problem, and then you should be helped. And in the current system, this is very difficult.
Yeah. And it seems like tapering strips offers at least part of the solution.
Yes. And what I would like to ask is, in fact, what we are doing is nothing more than a practical way to make possible what so many patients have been trying to do for years now. All these patients who are advising each other how to open the capsules, count the little granules in it, or to slice a pill, or to dissolve it in a solution, or to use a weighing scale, all these things. But they were basically all trying to make possible what we made possible, because we thought but many people, I think, will agree that it's ridiculous that if this is what is required, technically it's not difficult, then why have the pharmaceutical companies not solved this problem already years ago? Mm-hmm. They could have easily done it, and they never did.
I listened to a YouTube video by a patient who used the tapering strip, and she said, this is a way that we can avoid turning our own kitchens into laboratories. And I think that's what you're speaking about.
Yes, I think it's absurd that patients are doing this. And it's also absurd that actually doctors, also in the Netherlands, they give patients advice saying like, okay, I cannot prescribe you the required amount, but I can give you the advice to open up your capsule and to count the beads in it. Basically, they're advising something which at the same time, the medical community always says like, no, you don't mess with your medication. And well, I think this is very weird.
So Thank you so much, Peter, for speaking with me about the tapering strips and what you're trying to do and have done successfully.
You're welcome.
And any last words?
Well, one particular word, which is a very specific thing, because I get questions from patients, and what strikes me over the years is that every now and then I get patients who say that they are advised, and sometimes they come up with a solution themselves, like, I want to taper by taking today a given dose and tomorrow nothing, and then the same dose, and then the day after nothing, assuming that this will be a way to gradually reduce the dose of your drug. I would say don't do this. Okay. Because with drugs like paroxetine or venlafaxine, it only makes you sick. It doesn't work. The substance that's in it, the active substance, leaves your body so quickly that the amount of the drug in your body will change also from day to day. And it will change so much that it will really hurt you. Mm-hmm. So don't do this. If you taper, do it gradually. And take your medicines on a regular basis.
Okay. Thank you very much, Peter.
Okay. My pleasure.
So I just want to thank Akansha and Peter for that discussion. And if you'd like to know more about tapering strips, you can visit the website taperingstrip.org, which is a website of the User Research Centre of Maastricht University. Also, there are links to the other studies mentioned in the discussion in the post that accompanies this interview on madinamerica.com. So, thanks so much for listening, and until next time, take care. Thank you for listening to the Mad in America podcast. Visit madinamerica.com for more news, views, and updates.